The excellent attacking chances on the king side, the open G file and the open F file, and well, this is a superb position, and Gulko won a very nice game. If you take aggressive measures early on against 6a3, then I don't think you'll have any problems at all in the position. In particular, this pawn break f6 is very important indeed. I'm now going to look at a line which has been dismissed by theory, but is on the basis of very little evidence. I'm not sure the full story has been told in this system. I've seen many games where white has gone completely wrong and been in trouble from a very early stage in the game. The advantage of this system is that it can be played against both knight d2 and knight c3. Furthermore, it sidesteps established theory. Now in this position, black plays knight f6, a normal move, and after e5, instead of the standard knight to d7, black plays the knight into e4, very unusual. And, well, white ought to take this piece off, and black recaptures. So black is left with this pawn on e4, which is, well, a little bit cut off from the rest of its pawn army, so slightly vulnerable. But this pawn prevents white's knight coming out to its most natural square, f3. It also opens up the d file, and, well, black still has chances to attack white's centre with the pawn break c5. That's very important indeed. And because the d file has been opened, then there's more pressure against white's centre. Naturally, you can arrive at this same position if white plays 3 knight d2 instead of knight c3, knight f6, e5, and then knight e4. Knight takes e4, d takes e4, and it's exactly the same position. I was first drawn to this system having seen some games from a certain Mr. Conker from Poland. He's discovered some amazing ideas in this opening, being really creative. The first game I'd like to show is one of his games against Mr. Kruj. And the game went bishop e3. Now that seems like a sensible idea because it's bolstering the centre, and also white is preparing to play queen to g4 now that the d pawn is protected, and then queen takes e4. There's nothing to prevent that. So already white has a serious threat in this position of queen g4. In this case, black must react immediately. He must get some counterplay, and for that reason Mr. Conker's favourite move, c5, hitting out at white's centre. Now if queen g4, then you just take on d4. Here white must give up the centre, because if he tries to support the pawn on d4 with c3, then black plays c takes d4, and now if c takes d4, then bishop b4 check is very unpleasant indeed. For if bishop d2, then queen takes d4, and black is winning. If instead bishop takes d4, then knight c6 maintains the pressure on white's centre, and white has to give up one of the bishops here. In fact, probably the best move is bishop b5, bishop d7, and then bishop takes c6. But after bishop takes c6, I would prefer black's position, because you have the two bishops, the pawn on e4 isn't in any danger, and this white squared bishop here is potentially a game-winning piece because it has no opponent. So if we return to the position after c5, white really must give up the centre and play d takes c5. And now here black should play knight to d7, attacking the pawn on e5 and the pawn on c5. Now, if white continues in pawn grabbing mode and plays queen to g4, trying to get the pawn on e4, this is where some very interesting complications now occur. Mr. Conker played knight takes c5, and white took the bait and played bishop takes c5. Black must recapture, and now he went for the pawn on g7, queen takes g7. It looks dire for black, but in fact he gets tremendous counterplay because white has neglected his development on the king side. He played queen a5 check, so c3 is just about forced, and then he played his rook to f8, it was attacked. Now here it seems like white wins piece by playing b4, but that would lead to immediate disaster after bishop takes b4, c takes b4, queen takes b4 check, and now if king d1, then queen d4 picks up the rook in the corner, or king e2, queen b2 check also picks up the rook on a1. In the meantime, black is threatening to develop his pieces by playing bishop d7 and castle queenside, and white is lagging behind in development quite seriously here. Mr. Conker's opponent played queen takes h7, pure greed, and after bishop a3, really unusual move, he found himself in a spot of trouble. If b takes a3, then queen takes c3 check picks up the rook. So white had to play rook b1, and now comes queen takes e5, capturing that all-important central pawn. Now black has this lovely central pawn mass, which, backed up by the bishops, I think gives black the advantage. Even though he's a pawn down, I much prefer black's position. If at this point white captures the bishop on a3, then after queen takes c3 check, white's king is still far too dangerously exposed. So white played queen to h6, so that after b takes a3, queen takes c3 check, the queen can now return to d2 defending. So black dropped the bishop back to e7. Now white thought he'd better develop a few pieces, so he played knight h3, and then came bishop d7. So black is preparing to castle queenside. Queen came to f4, and black wisely declined the queen exchange, because white's king is still in a little bit of trouble. So he's now threatening the pawn down on a2, and white played b3. And black seized upon this and attacked the weakness that had been created on c3. So the queen came back to d2 to defend it, and defending the pawn on a2, and black castled, gaining even more time on white's queen, because there's some kind of discovered attack will soon occur. White brought the pawn up, attacking the queen, which came to a4. Bishop came to c4. And now black played e5, opening up the line of the bishop on d7 down towards the knight on h3, so a deadly discovered attack now threatened. So the queen had to move out of the way, queen e3, and the queen came back to c6, bishop e2, and now king b8, defending the pawn on a7. Rook d1, queen to g6. This effectively prevents white castling, for if castles, then rook g8 threatening mate, and now if g3, then bishop takes h3 wins piece, and if queen g3, then queen e6 also wins a piece. White's queen is attacked by the rook on g8, so must move away, and then queen takes h3 wins a piece. So in order to protect the pawn on g2, white played queen g3, and then black brought the queen back to e6. Now white still can't castle here because of rook g8, and when white moves the queen, queen e3, then queen takes h3. We've actually transposed back into the previous line. So white was unable to castle, and in fact he never found security for his king because of that. And black went on to win a very nice game. Well, here I think it's fairly clear that black is doing very well, because the knight on h3 is sidelined, and the white pawns on the queen side are very vulnerable, and black has this beautiful central pawn mass which is ready to roll down the board with f5, f4. So a really nice game from our friend Mr. Conker. Instead of taking on c5, most white players have actually given a check here. A sound developing move. And then knight d7. Looks strange to go backwards, but black is threatening a nasty check with queen a5 here. So white plays knight e2, and after check, knight c3. Now Conker has actually played bishop b4 a couple of times, and it's worked out very well for him. For instance, castles, bishop takes c3, bishop takes d7, bishop takes d7, b takes c3, queen takes e5, so it's getting that central pawn again. So white is pawns down here, so he played bishop d4, and now h5. So this forces white to go into this ending. Queen takes g7, queen takes g7, bishop takes g7, rook g8. And black actually went on to win this ending because he has a better pawn structure. He has nice central pawns again, and white's queenside pawns are very weak indeed. Conker has played this move bishop b4 a couple of times, so he must believe in it, but it still is a bit of a mystery to me why his opponents haven't played queen takes g7. Now maybe I'm overlooking something very simple here, but that looks like a strong move to me. It is very complicated indeed. Perhaps let me just give you a couple of sample variations. Well, bishop takes c3 check is the obvious move. B takes c3. Now queen takes c3. The king's in check and the rook on a1 attacked as well, so the obvious move looks like king e2. And now if queen takes c2 check, then bishop d2. Now at this point black has run out of checks, so he has to do something about his rook on h8. So rook f8. But here I really prefer white's position. He's ready to attack black's queen again with something like rook h to c1, and black is lagging way behind development. It's not clear how his king is going to get to safety. So yeah, doesn't look too good. Let's go back. Instead of bishop takes c3 check, queen takes b5 is possible. So queen takes h8 check, and now knight f8, blocking it. Black has the exchange down, but white cannot bring his king to safety on the king side because the queen on b5 prevents it. So castling queenside seems logical to me. And now black can play bishop takes c3, shattering white's queenside pawns. Now the question is, does black have enough compensation for the exchange? Well, I'm afraid to say I don't really think so here, because white also has attacking chances with bishop g5, for instance, getting on those weakened dark squares. Conker has played this move, bishop b4, a couple of times, so really must believe it, and he must have something prepared in this position. Though, as I said before, I don't immediately see it. Perhaps this position is worth investigating on your own. Instead of bishop to b4, a6 has actually been played a few times. And now one game has gone bishop a4, and then black played queen takes e5, grabbing an extra pawn, and many games have gone bishop takes d7 check, bishop takes d7. Now there's a beautiful trap in this position. The most natural move on the board for white seems to be queen takes e4, grabbing a pawn and defending the e-pawn at the same time. But then black plays bishop c6. So white moves the queen to where it defends the g-pawn, and now bishop a3. A killing move. It's just a superb move. So it's exactly the same theme as we saw in the first game. If the bishop is taken, then queen takes c3 check. So king e2, but now the white king gets pushed around all over the place. For instance, black could start with queen takes c2 check. Looks very nasty indeed. White could play bishop c1 here. It's a bit of a grovelling retreat. But then black plays queen takes e5. Now probably the best move is queen e2. And in this way, it's just about possible for white to avoid losing material. Actually, I think black's best here would just be to retreat the bishop. Play bishop d6. And with two bishops and a very sound position, I think black is clearly better. Instead, in the game Seminara Milano Santiago 1991, white felt his game to be so desperate that he evacuated his king from the centre immediately. But after bishop takes b2, attacking the rook on a1 as well as the knight on c3, he had to resign just a couple of moves later, because he's faced with unavoidable material loss. This bishop a3 trick is well worth remembering. I'm sure you'll catch quite a few players with that. Instead, in the game Ivanov-Malanyuk, Russia 1981, white played more sensibly with bishop d4 protecting the e-pawn. Then black played bishop c6. That's the pride and joy of his position. That light squared bishop doesn't have an opponent. A castle queenside, and black also castled on the queenside. So white still can't take that e-pawn. Knight takes e4, then queen takes a2 comes. So he played king b1. Now here it's looking difficult for black. It's looking very hard to defend the e-pawn. But there's a very interesting move here. Black could play rook takes d4. Now this is a very dangerous exchange sacrifice. Now after rook takes d4, then queen takes e5. Black has one pawn already for the exchange and two fantastic bishops and a central pawn mass. And this is a very unclear position indeed. So for instance, if rook h to d1, then black brings the bishop out to c5, then the rook retreats to d2, and now you could start pushing those centre pawns, f5. Those bishops are superb on c6 and c5, and in combination with this central pawn roller, I think black has sufficient compensation for the exchange. Alternatively, from this position, instead of f5, how about h5? Tempting white into playing queen g3, exchanging queens, but in fact black should head straight into that and then play e3, breaking up white's pawns. So f takes e3, bishop takes e3. black still only has one pawn for the exchange, but the pawns on g3 and g2 looking very weak indeed, and black has this superb pawn constellation, e6, f7, g7, h5, looking very strong indeed, and those bishops, wow, what a force. Black has excellent compensation for the exchange here. After bishop e3, c5, the positions that arise are highly complex, but I think there's plenty of scope for tricking and trapping your opponent, and it certainly shouldn't have been dismissed by theory. Naturally, white does have some alternatives to bishop e3, the best of which is probably bishop to c4. Now this is a clever move, because if black now hits out at the centre, as he'd like to do, then white will push the d-pawn on one square to d5. And that's a little bit nasty. If black captures, then either bishop or queen takes, probably bishop takes, d5. It's a little bit embarrassing for black, because now the pawn on e4 is likely to fall, and the bishop on d5 is in a superb position. So c5 can't really be played. So instead of playing c5, black employs a different strategy. He tries to control some of those central light squares. The first move that's usually played in this position is a6. Now that looks rather strange, but the idea is to play the pawn to b5, obviously attacking the bishop, and when the bishop moves away, let's say to b3, then bishop b7. And now you have the d5 square firmly under control. White can't even play c4 here. Well, it can, but it doesn't really increase control over d5 because it can just be taken by the pawn on b5. So after a6, white normally plays a4 to prevent this b5 move. And then black plays the b-pawn up anyway, but just one square, preparing to fianchetto the queen's bishop to b7. Now white develops his knight. It can go to e2 or to h3. We're now following the game Azaev-Laputian, fairly unpronounceable names, from a game in the Soviet Championship from 1984. Black played the bishop to b7. So now we can see the pawn on e4 is firmly protected by the bishop on b7. And later on perhaps you can hit out at the centre with c5. Not just yet though. The knight comes to f4. Now again, you see, if black plays c5, then white can advance with d5. It's very dangerous indeed. For that reason, black develops the knight on c6, attacking the d-pawn. Now if white plays d5, then black can play knight takes e5, and the bishop on c4 is attacked. Instead, white defends the d-pawn by playing the bishop out to e3. And now black moves the knight again to e7, just giving some additional support to that d5 square. And also the knight can prepare to go to f5, where it again attacks the d-pawn and also puts pressure on the bishop on e3. White castles sensibly, and now it's really about time black thought about developing his kingside pieces. He's lagging a little bit behind development here, but if he can develop his pieces successfully, then he has good control over the centre squares. That central square d5 is very important indeed. So Laputian from Armenia played g6. Azaev played the queen out to e2, looks sensible, preparing to bring rooks to the centre of the board. And then came knight to f5, attacking the pawn on d4. Then rook f to d1. Now a slightly unusual move. Laputian developed the bishop to h6. Now that's just putting a little bit more pressure on white's pieces, on the knight on f4, the bishop on e3 and the pawn on d4. Now at this point Azaev played his pawn to a5. That's a very tricky move indeed. He'd like to force black to exchange on a5. Let's see what happens if he does that. B takes a5, and then rook takes a5. And now black is left with this very weak pawn on a6, and his pawns, queenside pawns, look really ragged. So he's not going to do that. Alternatively, if black plays the pawn to b5, which looks like the most natural move in the position, unfortunately, white can capture this. Bishop takes b5 check, and if a takes b5, then queen takes b5 check. And after black gets out of the check, then queen takes b7, and white has won 2 pawns. Sensibly, black castled here and avoided all those problems. White captured on b6, black recaptured. White accepted the challenge and captured the pawn on a6. But now all hell broke loose in the position. Black took on f4, and now if he recaptures on f4, he didn't do this by the way, then black wins material by playing bishop takes a6, and if rook takes a6, knight takes d4, and if, for instance, queen c4, trying to hang on to that rook on a6, then knight f3 check, and if pawn takes knight, then queen takes rook check wins. So instead, white captured on b7, but after the rather surprising knight takes d4, that's a wonderful blow, black was already getting the better of things, because if bishop takes knight, then rook takes a1, and if rook takes a1, then queen takes d4, and the pawns on b2 and e5 are both hanging, and the position's already a little bit better for black. After knight takes d4, white played queen to c4, but black got the advantage by playing rook takes a1, rook takes a1, and now bishop takes e5. And he eventually went on to win this game in very fine style, as you'll see in the accompanying booklet. It's true that black rather had to contort himself in that game, but actually I think Laputien's plan was correct. He controlled those central squares very well indeed. In particular, I think the bishop on b7 is an excellent piece. In contrast to many variations of the French, this bishop is playing a really active role here, controlling d5 and also protecting the pawn on e4. And I've seen a few games where that bishop really comes into its own on b7. Another move which has been played a few times is knight on g1 to e2. It's a very direct idea, simply with the idea of playing knight g3 and coming around to take the pawn on e4. So it's essential that black hits out immediately at white's centre. And we come back to that move c5, very natural move indeed, so that if white plays d takes c5, then you can simply trade queens on d1, capture on c5, and black has a tremendous position. In view of that, white really ought to support the centre by playing the pawn to c3, but black can increase the pressure by playing knight c6, and now we can see how awkward that knight is looking on e2, because it's not going to run round to g3 and take the e-pawn very quickly because of the pressure on d4, and white is already on the defensive. Bishop e3 is a sensible move for white here, but then black captures on d4. White must recapture with the pawn in order to keep protecting e5. And now black can give a check on b4. And after knight c3, then queen a5. And white is already under some pressure here. There's one more possibility which you need to be aware of when playing this line. If we can go right back to the beginning. White plays the knight out to d2, black plays the knight to f6, and after e5, knight to e4. Now we've been looking at variations where white captures the knight on e4. But instead of that, white can play a very sensible move, bishop d3, which really forces black to capture white's knight on d2, and then white recaptures, bishop takes d2. Now, in most theoretical works, this position is usually given as being slightly better for white, but I don't really agree with that. I think black is fine after c5. White has two ways to play this position. He can either support the pawn on d4 or give up the central point d4 straight away. If he plays d takes c5, then a good move is knight to d7, attacking both c and e pawns. And after knight f3, then knight takes c5, and you're ready to capture the bishop on d3 if it ever starts looking dangerous. Black has typical French position here. The solid pawn chain f7, e6 and d5, and possibilities of pressure on the queen side down the c-file. The other method is to support the pawn on d4 with pawn to c3. Now black could just play knight c6, but there was a game which went queen b6, attacking d4 and b2 straight away. White played queen to b3, but after c4, black had no problems at all in this endgame. White must exchange queens, black recaptured, bishop came back to c2, and now b5. White played a3 to try and prevent the advance, but black just went on anyway. There's a pin on the a-file, so the pawn can't be captured by the pawn on a3, so white played c takes b4, but after knight c6, attacking the pawn on d4, white defended it by knight f3, black simply captured on b4 anyway, again exploiting this pin on the a-file. And black had absolutely no difficulties in this position and was slightly better in the game. This is between Pida and Przewoznik from a Polish tournament. If white is a knight c3 player, then it's not really possible for him to play this bishop d3 move. Because in this position, if white plays bishop d3, then black will capture on c3 and damage the pawn chain. Now, this is a very similar structure to the Winnow variation, but black has not given up this crucial bishop on f8. The problem in the Winnow variation that black has is that the g7 pawn is unprotected and the king side is slightly weak, but here black doesn't have those problems, but he still is able to mount pressure against these weakened queenside pawns. Black should continue just as normal in the Winnow variation by playing the pawn to c5. Now he has several plans available. He can play the queen to a5 to attack the pawns on c3 and a2, or he can perhaps play the pawn to b6 and exchange off that bad French bishop by playing bishop a6. It's a very attractive position for black because his king side is secure. The exchange variation has a tedious reputation. It's an attempt by white to take some of the dynamism out of the position, but don't worry, there are plenty of ways of livening it up. Usually the only draws you see with this line are between Russian grandmasters when they've agreed a draw beforehand, but there are loads of ways you can liven up the position. For instance, if white plays bishop d3 here, a favourite move of Korchnoi is to play c5, unbalancing the position straight away. He's won some beautiful games with this, including one which was only 14 moves long. It was against Tatai, international master Tatai, from Beersheva in 1978. Tatai played the knight out to f3, sensible developing move. Korchnoi played knight to c6, and Tatai couldn't resist giving that check on e2, but it's actually a wasted move. Black just plays bishop to e7. White captured on c5, and Korchnoi simply developed his knight. He doesn't worry because he knows he's going to get that pawn on c5 back again. White played h3. That's a waste of a move. He was worried about the bishop coming out to g4 to pin the knight, but, well, he should have just suffered with that. Castled, and white castled as well. And now black just recaptured the pawn on c5. Now this is exactly the position that Korchnoi wanted. Has really active pieces in return for this isolated pawn on d5. I actually very much like playing with an isolated pawn, but perhaps it's a matter of taste. But black has an excellent attacking position already. White played the pawn to c3. And now we can see what a mistake it was just checking on e2. It was really a wasted move because the rook comes to e8 with gain of time, and the queen just had to move away. And black brought the queen out to d6. Just compare the two positions. Black is so much better developed than white, has a really active attacking position. And it was at this point that white really collapsed. You wouldn't believe it, but white's game is in its last throes here. He played knight b to d2. And at this moment he was shocked by the wonderful move queen to g3. Fantastic idea. Obviously the queen can't be captured because of the pin to the king by the bishop on c5. And in this position bishop takes h3 is threatened, and that would be mate. Tatai spotted that one, played bishop f5, but unfortunately that leaves the e2 square unguarded, and Korchnoi went straight in. Rook e2, increasing the pressure on f2. White has no defence here. He played knight d4, but after knight takes d4 he had to resign. If pawn takes queen, then knight takes c2 check, and that wins the house. Or if pawn takes knight, then just bishop takes d4, and again there's nothing to prevent black crashing through on f2, and that's the end of the game. When white plays the exchange variation, he can employ various setups, but in each case black must use the fact that he has the second move, and so can react to white's play to unbalance the position. I've given several games illustrating this in the accompanying booklet. A more popular attempt to avoid black's main systems against the French is to play the pawn out to d3 and play the so-called King's Indian attack. This was a great favourite of the former world champion Bobby Fischer. Now white's main idea is that after d5 he wants to eventually put this pawn on e5 and use it as a spearhead for his attack. The main variation this a few years ago was something like this: knight to d2, black plays c5, knight to f3, knight c6, and now g3. This is all part of white's system. Knight to f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, white castles, black castles as well. And now here white plays this move e5, taking the black knight away from the king side. Knight d7, attacking the pawn, and white plays rook e1. Now this is exactly the position white is aiming for. This was the standard position of the old main line a few years ago. But I wouldn't want to play into this as black. White has an automatic attack here by playing the knight to f1 and then advancing this pawn as far as it can go, and then manoeuvring this knight around via h2 to g4. White has excellent attacking chances. I know that black has counterplay on the queen side, but I just don't see why I should subject my king to this attack. This is exactly what white is aiming for when he plays this system. The line I'm recommending against the King's Indian attack simply aims to frustrate white's attacking plans on the king side. I don't want white to play e5 at all, and it's possible to prevent that move. So white plays knight to d2. You play the pawn to c5 as usual. Knight f3. Knight c6. g3. Bishop d6. That's the first slightly unusual move. Controlling the e5 square. Bishop g2. And now knight to e7. It's a very important move. Not knight to f6. Castles. And black castles as well. And now if white tries his standard attacking idea with rook e1, threatening e5, then this can simply be prevented by playing the queen to c7. And if now queen to e2, again preparing this e5 move, then you stop it completely by playing pawn to f6. If I can just go back a couple of moves and show how the game Zaitsev against Gufeld, two Russian players, how their game continued. White actually played c3 here. Black developed with bishop d7. And now queen e2, threat, e5, must be prevented, there we go, f6. And now white is a bit frustrated. It's not clear how he's going to continue here. He played his knight to f1, clearing the line of the bishop on c1, but well, I don't see a clear plan for him. In fact, here, black pushed on. It's almost as though black is taking the white pieces here. He's the one who has the space advantage. White developed with bishop d2, and black played e5. It now has a very strong centre indeed. White played rook c1. Black played the rook over to c8. White played h3. Black continued with bishop e6. The knight crawled round to h2. Queen d7, getting it out of the line of the rook on c1, and attacking the pawn on h3, so white played pawn to h4. And now black started this advance on the queen side with b5. He has an excellent position. His plan is to use his space advantage to eventually infiltrate on the queen side. Notice how white's play on the king side has really come to nothing, while black really dominates on the other side of the board. Fischer, playing white, once had to face this system, and he played much more aggressively than in the example I just gave. He played his knight out to h4, intending to advance his f-pawn up the board, and he won a very fine game against Ivkov. But since then, numerous improvements have been found for black. One very solid way in which to meet white's advance of the f-pawn is to play bishop d7, and after f4, just play f5. The pawn on f5 takes away some key squares from white. For instance, the g4 square, as well as blocking the f-pawn's advance. Now white has a slight problem here of what to do about the pawn on e4. Should he leave it there, push it on, capture on d5? None of them are really that great. For instance, if white plays e5, then the bishop just retreats. Now the centre's blocked and black has a free hand to advance on the queen side. Or if pawn takes d5, black just recaptures, and again doesn't have any real problems here. There was a game, Harding-Penrose, from 1972 where white played b3, trying to develop his bishop on the long diagonal. That bishop on c1 is rather blocked in by pawn on f4 and the knight on d2. Black played b5. White now captured on f5. Black recaptured. Now bishop b2. Now black played queen b6. I think black has a tremendous space advantage here, which he went on to use very successfully. Played rook a to e8. Now this is important because that weak square on e3 black is going to try and get into. Queen h5. White still has some attacking ambitions, but really then they're going to come to nothing. Knight b4, attacking c2. Knight df3, and now that's very important. Black has d4 blocking that bishop on b2. Now once that's blocked out of the attack, then really it's going to be very difficult for white. Rook f2. Black played knight e to d5, threatening to move the knight into e3. From there it hits the bishop on g2, the pawn on c2, and white is in big trouble. My advice is steer clear of the old main line. Play this system and you will get all the counterplay on the queen side without allowing yourself to fall prey to an attack on the king side. In this video I've advocated a complete repertoire against e4. The French is a strategically sound opening, and even at the highest level white often overpresses and is punished. If you're feeling adventurous, then I definitely recommend you give Mr. Conker's knight e4 a try. It leads into uncharted territory and is an excellent surprise weapon. Good luck.